encourage you and invite you to turn in your own Bibles to Judges chapters 14 and 15. If you don't have a Bible with you, feel free to grab one from one of the seats in front of you. And it's on page 214. We're going to be in chapters 14 and 15 of Judges, a unique time in the history of God's people, Israel. As we begin, I was struck when I was at a conference this week by many things, but one thing was just one simple phrase of a song that I think maybe could help us kind of prepare ourselves for tackling with these two chapters in Judges. And it's this simple phrase: ponder anew what the Almighty can do. Ponder anew what the Almighty can do. What can God do? What can God do? Well, we would say He can do anything, right? Would you say that? The God of the Bible can do anything. But He doesn't do anything and everything, so we have to say things like this: God can do anything, but He chooses not to do certain things, right? He can do anything, but He chooses not to do certain things. And when we say things like that, I hope we're not insinuating that God's limited. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, I hope when you heard me even say that, you don't think that we are insinuating that God is limited just because He chooses not to do certain things. We're starting off deep this morning. It gets a little bit lighter, and then we'll end deep again. But this is kind of how we're going to intro this morning. When God chooses to not do things that we certainly know He can do, may we not give off the feeling that He's chosen to do something less. Let me ask it like this: does God do anything that isn't great? Like even the stuff He chooses not to do, those are still great, aren't they? Whatever He does do. What can God do? Anything and everything that God does is great. How about this? Even more, this is where we're getting to the heart. What impacts what God would do? Is it completely disconnected from us? Is He a God that is completely disconnected, and whatever He does, while it's great and good, there's nothing that bears any kind of connection as to what He would do, what He would accomplish? Does the fact that God can accomplish anything excuse you and I from being the types of people in which He would accomplish things through? We starting off deep? Did I lose you already? I hope not. I hope not. This is the crux of the story of Samson. It's these kinds of themes. Does the fact that God can accomplish anything excuse us from being the types of people in which He would accomplish things through us? Does it matter what we are like for God to accomplish certain things? I think of it like this maybe. Maybe it's rude and crude, but you have the guys pulling this cart and they have a square wheel, right? And they're like working hard and they're busy and they're pulling this cart around, right? You can just feel them. And the cartoon is funny because the guy's like, hey, I got a really nice wheel that's shaped better than that one. I bet you could accomplish maybe more. It'd be easier. I don't know, but why don't you? This is what you, with this, you could maybe accomplish more. And they're like, no thanks, we're good. We'll just keep clunking along, right? Or maybe in a strange way, more modern, it's like this picture, right? Oh, man, that thing has a beast of an engine. But when you put iron, right? Iron-edged wagon wheels on a vehicle like that, all of a sudden your visions of off-roading and going 80 miles an hour down the highway are like, I don't think I'm going to do that. Right? I mean, wooden wagon wheels? Yeah, that's going to impact that car's ability to function and how it gets around, right? Simple. Last week we connected our personal holiness to us effectively carrying out our God-given calling. It was like if we don't grow in personal holiness, it's like being ill-prepared for a specific task. We connected it in themes like this. I need to know and handle the word correctly in order to preach well. If you had me jump up here and I really didn't know this, didn't know how to handle it well, didn't really spend much time in it this past week, I wouldn't be able to do this, right? You need to have committed yourself and disciplined yourself in patience and love for your enemy when, in order to reflect Christ to your coworkers, and you're slandered by your boss, your overseer, you're able to return that slander with blessing and kind words. And if you really want to show and reflect Christ to your coworkers, then you have got to be prepared, right? And this happens all over the place. Today's slightly different, but it's just as important. We're connecting our personal holiness to what God would accomplish, like being a blunt, square-shaped wheel that won't accomplish what a new hydrogen-infused rubber tire with titanium chrome rims would. Here's the strangeness that I can't wrap my mind around, but I think it is this passage's point. God has woven into the many motivations for our obedience the motivation of what God would accomplish or what he wouldn't accomplish. It's dangerous, so I'll rephrase it because you can abuse it, but it's like this. Our personal holiness has been woven into God's sovereign will. It's connected to what God would accomplish through us. It matters what kind of person you are. Deeply. We cannot excuse the fact that God can do anything to allow us to be people like Samson, right? I'll read one passage, a different one, and then we'll dive into this Judges series, just so you hear this. Romans 12 reads like this: I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what God wants to accomplish through you, what God would accomplish through you. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, to not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. We are to use the gifts that God has given us in humility, using the measure of faith God has given us, by presenting our bodies as living sacrifices, not being conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our mind, so that we can discern what God's will is, so that God would accomplish things through us. It's like if you don't pursue and increase in personal holiness, there's a sense that God just won't accomplish certain things through you. Let's ponder anew what the Almighty can do. Let's ponder anew what the Almighty can do. It's a heavy introduction to Judges 14 and 15, but it's true. It's right. Now let's see it. Samson. This is the good stuff, right? This is the stuff that if your kids, little kids, are ever bored by the Bible, you just go to Samson's story, don't you? You just go to this story, and maybe you skip over a few parts that maybe a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old couldn't handle. But if you want to get him interested, you just read this. and then you close the Bible, like you just read it, and then you just close it and say, ha ha, there, and you just leave. And they're like, whoa, right? You don't have to say anything else. We're probably going to say a little bit else, but here's what Judges 14 and 15, for my help, looks like. It's a mess, but there are just some key things that we're going to walk through. As we begin, we're going to go through a wedding, a pursuit of a wife, and then we're going to encounter a lion. And there's some stuff that goes on with this lion that's significant. Then there's a giant feast. Significant things happen at and as a result from that feast. And then we dive into not foxes, but some jackals. You see the big bushy tails. There's something that goes on with the tails there. And then we end with a donkey jawbone. Let's start reading. The first one, the pursuit of a Philistine wife by Samson. Chapter 14 reads like this. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all of our people, that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for God was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. First thing, right? Hopefully you caught all that. Samson is pursuing a Philistine wife. And he's making huge demands on his parents to not just let him, but to have them go get one, that one specifically for him. It continues. The next scene is with this lion thing. God throws a test at Samson. Verse 5 reads like this. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him, not them, he's alone, him, roaring. Well, then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what had been done. Then he went down and talked with a woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days, he returned to take her. And on that journey, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm, not colony, the Hebrew word community of bees, in the body of the lion and honey. It's another test. It's a test. He scraped it out in his hands and went on eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. Oh, this is awesome. Interesting, right? Some of you are like, that makes no sense. Where is the theological explanation for the lion and the honey and stuff? We'll get there, but let's just hang and be like, this is a weird story, right? The next scene we have is a feast, verse 10. So his father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do it, or at least the Philistines had. Verse 11. As soon as the people saw him, Philistines, they brought 30 companions to be with him. Bodyguards. They kind of saw Samson was throwing a feast and going to have a wedding, and they kind of knew a little bit of his reputation, not about the lion or anything, but just his presence alone caused them to say, let's just set up 30 bodyguards kind of around and in the midst of this feast for protection's sake. Verse 12, and Samson said to them, let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. That's a nice offer. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Okay, this is good. Fun little wager here. And they said to him, put your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them like this, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days, those 30 bodyguards could not solve this riddle. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is. lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? And Samson's wife, they're in the marriage process. This feast is part of this marriage process, wept over him and said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is." And he said to her, "Behold, I've not even told my father or my mother. And shall I tell you?" And she wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him so hard. Then she told the riddle to her people. And the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer," my wife, "you would not have found out my riddle." And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house. Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. Whoa, right? Once again, you have to be saying, what do you make of all of this? There's so many weird, strange things that just aren't fully explained. And you go, really? Did this stuff happen? And why? And I don't get it. Great, let's keep reading. We move on from a feast and we get to this jackal part. Hopefully you've been following. Samson's wife, Philistine quasi-wife, betrayed him. She was threatened by her own people. Crude people, right? Samson killed 30 people to pay the debt that he had set up. It's just chaos, right? And he leaves the feast to go to his father's house. Chapter 15 picks up, and after some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, "I'll go into my wife in the chamber," but her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, "I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please, take her instead." Then Samson said to them, "This time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm." So Samson went, caught 300 foxes, or really jackals, and took torches. And he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain. Remember, it was wheat harvest of the Philistines, and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I'll quit." And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, meaning hip upon thigh and thigh upon hip. He made great piles of people, flesh. And he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock at Etam. What? We're not even done yet. Did you follow all that? Is the synapses in your brain firing like crazy? They should be. You should be grappling with theology. You should be grappling with what is happening. Why is this in the Bible? How do we make sense of this? You should be trying to fit this into some box of your theological thinking right now. You should be grasping for what is really going on. Well, then we come to maybe the most famous story of Samson of all. It's the jawbone of the donkey, but this is how it comes about. After Samson rejected the offer for a second wife, and in violence slaughtered a great number of the Philistines, pick up in verse 9. Well, the Philistines came up, they encamped in Judah, and they made a raid. They attacked Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We've come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock at Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" It's a little bit like Moses with the Egyptians, isn't it? Remember when Moses goes and speaks to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gets annoyed that he has come to pester him? So what does Pharaoh do? He raises the quota that the Israelites need to do in order to fill their slave back-breaking work of making bricks each day, right? It's kind of the same thing that the men of Judah are like, "Samson, you messed up a good thing we had going on here. Yes, the Philistines were ruling over us, but it was a good thing, man," right? So they come to him, and they're looking to bind him. Verse 12, and they said to him, "We've come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves." And they said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands," which sounds a lot better, right? "We will surely not kill you." So they bound him with two new ropes and brought him up from the rock. And when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Oh, then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that is caught in fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. That's the work of the Lord, right? I don't know if this next part is. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. It gives a strange, eerie, gross, graphic depiction of like there's a dead donkey near him, and he just rips the jaw right out of the skull, right? Fresh. Sorry for that little detail there. And put out his hand and took it. And with it he struck 1,000 men. And then he sings this song of tribute, not to God, but to himself. With the jawbone of a donkey, one heap. And there's 2 heaps. And there's 3 heaps. And he's singing to the Philistines about the piles of men that are dead at his hand. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've struck down 1,000 men. And as soon as he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand. Verse 18, this tag at the end, reads like this. And he was very thirsty. And he called upon the Lord. The first time Samson that we know of is called upon the Lord. And this is what he asked for. "You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Verse 20, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. It's a lot. I purposely wanted to read both of those chapters in full to have us really grapple with the word and feel what this story entails. Hopefully you can kind of see each scene, if you will, primary scene, and some of the facets that are going on. But when you get to the end, chapter 15, verse 20, if you're like me, you're probably saying something like, "So where are we at the end of all this?" Like, besides being disoriented and very exhausted, right? Just to keep all the details straight, and you're like one thing from another, and they're miraculous, and how do we make sense of this? It's like we're in Alice in Wonderland, right? What is up is down, and what is down is up. Doesn't it feel like that? That strangeness? What is right is wrong, and what is wrong is right, and who, I don't know. How do you make sense of this? We start by looking at the fatal flaws that are exuded in this text, and things start to become a little bit clear. If we understand anything, it needs to be the destructive, fatal flaws. We see 2 primary ones. Now, there are a lot of expressions of each of these, But first, we'll kind of look at Samson, and we're going to go through the text, and I hope you have a Bible in front of you, because we're going to go by kind of verse, almost by verse, and just quick bullet point how Samson's fatal flaw can be summed up as, I do what I want to do. And I wonder if you've ever had that flare about you. I'm not talking about when you were in the terrible twos or tremendous and tumultuous threes, right? Where we all resided for a period of time. Where that kind of flaw, it was when our sinful nature first gave birth in our life, and what usually came, give me that, I want that, no, I don't want, right? It was that kind of feeling. I hope you felt that from the very beginning to the very end with Samson, but now we're just going to press into that. I do what I want to do. Look at verse 2 with me of chapter 14. He saw a woman and he wanted her, disregarding completely God's very word that said, when the Lord brings you into this land, you shall not intermarry. I don't care what God says. I want her. I see her and I want her. She's attractive, she's appealing, she's pleasing to my eye. I mean, I could go on for a whole sermon on each and every one of these examples. How many times do you just see something and say, I want it? Even if it's no good for you. Even if it's no good for me. I want it. I don't care. I want it. Just hear this fatal flaw even play itself out, not only in Samson's life, but our own life. Verse 3. This is when his father and mother say, maybe you should get another wife. And look at Samson's response. Get her for me, for she's right in my eyes. There's two things here. He disrespected and dishonored his parents. The fifth of the Ten Commandments is honor your father and mother, right? He's completely, blatantly disrespecting and dishonoring his parents. Teenagers, young children, when you dishonor and disrespect your parents, you are basically saying, I want to do what I want to do. I don't care what God says. It says more about your relationship with God's law than it does with your relationship with your parents. In the same verse, you can see that he was driven by what? What was right in his eyes. He didn't care about counsel or God, just what was right in his eyes. Verse 7, the same thing. It says at the end that this Philistine woman was right in whose eyes? Samson's and Samson's eyes alone. Verse 8, which is interesting, it says that he turned aside after killing the lion and keeping it a secret, which was a test from the Lord. Why did the lion come at all? It was a test from the Lord to see, hey, Samson, I have instilled in you and blessed you with like a supernatural strength. I want to make sure you know that you have that strength, and I want you to know where it comes from so that you'll use it for good purposes and good ends. It's interesting, this very thing that was a test that he maybe halfway passed, it says he returned back to it. Why is that significant? Well, he broke the Nazirite vow that he was birthed in. Numbers 6:6, he shall not go near a dead body. Anyone who takes this vow, his mom and he himself took this vow when he was in her womb. He's blatantly disrespecting, once again, what God says. Can you hear, even as I go on, and I'll go a little quicker now, but just hear possibly themes even within our culture. Who cares what God says about anything? Whether it's sexuality, whether it's interpersonal relationships, whether it's the local church. Who cares what God says? I want to do what I want to do. How easy is it for you and I, who are very acquainted with God's word, to drift into the same fatal flaw? To be more Samson-like. Well, he gives some of this honey in verse 9 of chapter 14 to his parents. That was not a nice blessing. He just, in a sense, contaminated them as well. Anyone who touches a dead carcass, not just the one who took a Nazarite vow but circles back in a rotting dead corpse. They touch it, and then they go and maybe take something from that corpse and have it touch someone else. They then are exuding and making someone else unclean willingly. What is Samson doing here? Verse 10, he throws a 7-day feast, just like the Philistines did in their ritual for weddings. There's nothing wrong with a 7-day feast. There's nothing wrong with wine at the feast. But there is an insinuation that Samson took part in drinking wine at this feast, and he was explicitly from the Nazarite vow not to take part in it. Verse 12, when he gives that first riddle, remember that riddle he gives? It's an impossible riddle. He hasn't told his parents. He hasn't told his wife. He's told no one about the lion and the honey. He's basically seeking ungodly gain. He's like, hey, I can get 30 pieces, I can get 60 pieces of clothes here. I baited them in. They're all my bodyguards. I'll provoke them. Oh, tough guys. Let's see if you can handle one of my riddles, let alone my fist, right? He baits him and provokes him into an impossible situation where the only one who's going to get anything out of it is him. Like, does this check your spirit at all? Because you have these same temptations to have this flaw abide in you, don't you? I do. Verse 17. This is really interesting. A man of great strength and fortitude and really a great commitment to do what he wants cannot resist his quasi-Philistine wife. She pressed him so hard. Big, tough guy. Can't have the discipline or self-control to not tell his quasi-wife something, the riddle. It's the facade. The flaw that Samson has alludes to a great strength when in reality it displays a great weakness and insecurity. Verse 19, it says at the end, he went away in hot anger, so the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. He used the Lord's power to murder 30 people to pay the debt that he owed for them answering the riddle right. And that didn't satisfy his anger. Instead, he sinned so badly in his anger that his soon-to-be father-in-law thought that he was divorcing his wife out of hatred. And then when he comes back, the father-in-law says, oh, sorry, I really thought you hated her. I thought you were divorcing her by leaving us for a few days. Now that you're back, he offers her his second son, which in and of itself, that offer, or second daughter, my daughter is more beautiful. Like, what ungodly people the Philistines are. He offers up his more beautiful daughter to just satisfy the wrath. And guess what? It backfires. Samson's, I do what I want. No one will tell me who to marry. I don't care if she's the most beautiful woman in the world. He was kind of probably leaning towards his lustful eye. Well, if you liked my first, he won't say no to her. She's so beautiful. And even in that, you see something else is driving Samson. It's not just the fleshly lust. It's this. I decide what I am going to marry. He objectifies women. Chapter 15, verse 7, we also saw very clearly Samson, if this is what you do, I swear I'll be avenged on you. And then he says this, and after I'll quit. Have you ever said that? I'm going to do this one more time and then I'm going to quit. Why? Because I can do what I want to do. No, you can't. The want, the sinful passions that brew inside us and lead us to act out in sin, they control us, James says. And we are fooling ourselves when we say, hey, I'm going to give in one more time. For Samson, it's I'm going to go on a rampage one more time, and then I'll be done with the violence. So he strikes him, verse 8, hip upon thigh, and then the violence is supposed to stop, right? Does it stop? No. It actually escalates. Has that ever been you? I'm not going to do that again. This is the nature of addiction in some regards. I'm not going to do that again. I promise. You even say it out loud to people around you. I'm not going to do it again. And you do. And you actually find yourself in a deeper expression of it than before. And then even have in verse 15 the whole jawbone of a donkey. We need to be careful when we celebrate that story to our children as a great wild victory, because he's breaking the Nazirite vow as he touches a dead carcass again. He uses his great power and strength and gifts, but he does not condition them in holiness. And so he uses what God has blessed him with for evil. The Philistines have this mantra that they repay evil with evil. You see this throughout. A person acts and they react worse. It's evil upon evil and upon evil, and the story feels chaotic and disorienting because it starts with a Philistine wife being pursued, and it just escalates. Action, reaction, reaction to the reaction, reaction to the reaction, reaction to the reaction, until at the very end, you just go, this is a never-ending cycle. This is the way of life. When you pursue repaying evil with evil, you never can have the last word. How do you have the last word when you're in an argument with your wife? She stabs you with her words, you stab her back, and what do? You just say, man, if I could really stab her in the right spot, it would end all of this stabbing with our words. No. We know that. It usually stops when someone stops stabbing the other person. They stop repaying evil with evil. That's what 1 Peter teaches us. So this is gross. We are at a complete mess here at the end. Before we move on, I want to think about what C.S. Lewis says about fatal flaws. He says, you see, looking back, you see how all the plans you ever made always have shipwrecked on that fatal flaw you have. Incurable jealousy or laziness or touchiness or muddle-headedness or bossiness or ill-tempered or changeableness. He says, this is the next great step in wisdom, to realize that you also are just that sort of person. You also have a fatal flaw in your character. All the hopes and plans of others have again and again shipwrecked on your character, just as your hopes and plans have shipwrecked on theirs. It is no good passing this over with some vague general admission such as, oh, of course I know I have my faults. It's important to realize that there is some really fatal flaw in you. Something which gives the others just that same feeling of despair which their flaws give you. It's almost certainly something you don't know about. Something like maybe halitosis is a good example, he says. Bad breath. And you say, why? Why don't people tell me? Believe me, they've tried to tell you over and over again, and you just couldn't take it. Perhaps a good deal of what you call their nagging or bad temperament towards you is just their attempts to make you see the truth. Every time the Lord shows up, I hope you catch this vision that it's God saying, here's a chance, Samson. Here's a chance for you to see your fatal flaw and to not act on it. I will empower you. My Spirit will rush into you. But Samson is deaf, blind to that opportunity, and just uses all of that energy and unction to express the fatal flaw. What did God accomplish in all of this? I will tell you this. Much. Much. It doesn't feel like it. He accomplished much. It may not feel like it, but it's miraculous how much he accomplished. Look at chapter 14, verse 4. Right at the beginning. Samson's demanding a Philistine wife, and what does God do? God allows Samson to get what he wants. It says, for the Lord was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. God, in spite of the fatal flaw of Samson, was able to use him to accomplish this incredible work. We see it in 15, verse 3, and we knock off the intermarriage thing first. 15:3, Samson, here, he's already pursued to intermarry with the Philistines. Here, in verse 3, he has been offered a Philistine bride for free, and he rejects it. God has used Samson's fatal flaw toward his great end. Now, in marriage between the men of Judah, at least, and the Philistines, it's going to be fractured. It isn't going to be a common, normal thing. It is not going to be allowed by either side as much. How else was God going to accomplish that? How did God accomplish that? That is miraculous. Especially in spite of who Samson was. Amen? Have you ever felt that? You look back on your life and you go, man, I cannot believe God did anything with what I gave for him to use. It's grace. Even more, though, we have this general peace, right? We go to chapter 15, verse 9. Here we have something that hasn't happened for 20 years. The Philistines raid the men of Judah. The Philistines are ruling over the Israelites in this case, and they end up attacking them. Any kind of peace they had, now it is gone. So much so that there's a battle where 1,000 Philistines lose their life, and deep enmity between an ungodly, uncircumcised group of the Philistines is created with the men of Judah. There's this division that is finally seen. It hasn't been seen in a while. These two groups have been you couldn't quite figure out who was who. God has disturbed the comfort that his people had with being like the ungodly. What would it take for God to do that in your life, in my life? To disturb me so that what I became very comfortable with in regards to means of ungodliness and sinful activity and sinful passions, he disturbs it to where I begin to go, ugh, I don't want that anymore. Do you remember when God shook you from your fatal flaw for just a moment? It was before he saved you from it, when he just shook you. When he shook you from living in sin, when he shook you from liking what was ungodly, when he shook you from letting your sinful passions drive you, when he disturbed your peaceful way of the sinful life. This is what we say when we say that Jesus ruins our lives. Our lives seem to be going along so fine, indulging in sin, convinced that the misery we feel can be alleviated if we just give in and let our sinful passions drive us some more. We let our fatal flaws lead us around, but there's this moment when our desires begin to change. In spite of our fatal flaw dominating us, what does God accomplish? He disturbs us deeply. He shakes us from wanting that anymore. And there begins the distinction from the world. And it starts with just a disturbance that shakes the very foundations of the souls of men and women. The miracle has begun. When did God bring that about in your life? We know when he accomplished that completely. In his sinless Son, we read in Hebrews 10, 8-14, says, when God above said, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, then Jesus Christ added, behold, I have come to do your will, Father. Very different than Samson. I've come to do your will. Your will. And when he does that, he does away with the first in order to establish the second. The first is the sinful way of life. Jesus came to completely disrupt that first way of life. in order to establish the second. And by that, we will have been sanctified, set apart positionally with God through the offering of the body of Christ Jesus once for all. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ, he offered his life for one time, a single sacrifice for sins, and then he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until what? His enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. And by a single offering, he has protected for all time those who are being sanctified. Do you remember in Judges, in Samson's birth, chapter 13, verse 5, it says that God was raising him and calling him up, and he would begin to save Israel from Philistines. Did you recall at the end of chapter 15 of Judges, it said, and Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. What is it? We feel a sense of incompleteness with Samson. He only begins to save. These days, there's never rest for Israel. It's described as the days of the Philistines. Samson never brings rest to just a minuscule enemy like the Philistines. What has Christ done? His enemies will be made a footstool. This isn't a beginning. This is a completion. He is establishing a whole second way of life for you and I. What has God done in his sinless Son? He's disturbed the entire sinful order. There is such hope and joy now for you and I. So then we think, well, what about the adopted children? As you and I pursue holiness, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Moreover, what can God do? I mean, if God does things in spite of Samson, what can or would God do in light of you and I pursuing holiness? 2 Corinthians 10, it says, for though we walk in the flesh, it's true still, we're not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Have you ever thought about destroying a stronghold? A spiritual stronghold that is making someone utterly miserable and destined for eternal destruction. We can actually destroy that. God has woven our personal holiness into maybe accomplishing something like that. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion, not because we're deep, rich theologians. It's because the weapon of our holiness is raised. And so we take every thought captive to obey Christ. And that's how disobedience is simply punished. Let's go to Ephesians 6 real quick. Finally, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to what? Just stand against the schemes of the devil. That's a big deal. To stand. It says we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Can you imagine standing against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places? Standing. Isn't that what usually you have to stand against when you see maybe your enemy? It isn't necessarily just the person there who's in the flesh. It's everything that's surrounding. It's the demon on your shoulder whispering slanderous things for you to use against them. It's the battle, the evil one in the heavenly realms right in that moment. That is what we, as we grow in holiness, can stand and resist. Withstand in the evil day. Stand firm. What would God accomplish? He would disturb our comfort with the world. And he would disturb Satan's power over us. Robert Murray McShaney says, it is not great talents God blesses so much as great likeness to Jesus, holiness. Listen to this. A holy minister, a holy follower of Jesus is an awful weapon in the hand of God. If God had in his hand a Samson, and he actually began to save Israel from the Philistines. Man, and Samson was like a square wheel, wasn't he? No holiness. What would God do with a wheel that could maybe get somewhere, do some things easier, make better ground, have better traction, a smoother ride? What would God do, accomplish through those of us who grow in holiness by the power of Jesus Christ and His Spirit? Amen.